What if the most important promise you ever made was the one that was breaking you? For Clara, that promise was a lead weight in her gut, heavier than the industrial tray she balanced on one trembling arm. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gilded Spoon, Chicago's afternoon skyline blurred into a watercolor of gray and steel, a perfect mirror for the storm inside her. In less than an hour, they would be lowering her mother into the cold Illinois earth. And she would not be there. The woman who had taught her to draw constellations on foggy window panes, who had smelled of lavender and rising bread, who had fought a ravenous, 2-year war with cancer that had consumed every penny and every last ounce of her strength, would be eulogized by strangers and her heartbroken brother, while Clara served seared scallops to people who complained if the foam on their cappuccino was asymmetrical. Her phone vibrated in the pocket of her starched black apron. A text from her brother, Leo. "It's starting soon, Clara. Please, Dad's side of the family is asking for you." She squeezed her eyes shut, the image of her Aunt Carol's pitying gaze flashing in her mind. Clara couldn't face that. She couldn't face any of it. She had made a choice, a brutal, necessary calculation of survival, and now she had to serve its consequences on a silver platter. The Gilded Spoon was not a place for messy human emotions. At 22, Clara had worked here for 3 years, a tenure longer than most of the Ivy League summer interns who treated the job as a sociological experiment. She'd been hired for her quiet efficiency and her artist's eye for plating, a skill she'd honed sketching in the margins of her notebooks. The restaurant was a temple of minimalist chic, all polished concrete floors, muted lighting, and chairs that were more sculpture than furniture. It was a place where wealth was a whisper, not a shout, and the staff were expected to be as unobtrusive as the air conditioning. Her manager, Mr. Sterling, was a man carved from ice. He managed with a perpetual sneer and a stopwatch, viewing his staff not as people but as components in a machine. When Clara had approached him yesterday, her voice, a raw, shredded thing, to beg for the day off, he hadn't even looked up from his ledger. "A funeral is a personal matter, Miss Hayes," he'd said, his pen scratching a final, damning total on the page. "The Gilded Spoon is a business. We are already short-staffed due to Maria's family emergency. Your shift is your responsibility. If you cannot fulfill it, I will find someone who can. Permanently." He didn't need to say more. The mountain of medical debt her mother had left behind was Everest. Leo, a history teacher with a young family, was already stretched to his breaking point. This job, with its meager paycheck and occasional generous tip from a tourist who didn't know any better, was the only thing keeping Clara from drowning. Her mother's last coherent words to her had been a fierce, whispered command. "Don't you dare let this break you. Don't you dare give up your life for my death. You promise me, Clara Bell. You promise." So she had promised, and now that promise felt like a betrayal. As she moved through the hushed dining room, the clink of silverware on porcelain was like a drumbeat counting down the minutes she was missing. She refilled water glasses, described the amuse-bouche with a voice she didn't recognize as her own, and avoided catching her reflection in the polished surfaces. The face that would look back at her would be a traitor's. Pale, hollow-eyed, her auburn hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. The lunch rush was a blur of faces she knew too well. The lawyers from the firm upstairs, the society wives discussing charity galas, the tech bros celebrating a new round of funding. They were the regulars, the lifeblood of the restaurant. And today, their casual indifference was an agony. Then there was the man in the corner booth, table 12. He was not a regular. She would have remembered him. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face etched with lines that spoke of shrewd decisions and long-haul flights rather than laughter. He wore a simple, dark grey suit that probably cost more than her car, but it was tailored with an understated perfection that drew no attention to itself. He'd been there for an hour, nursing a single glass of scotch and a bottle of still water, his gaze sweeping the room with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He wasn't just looking, he was assessing. He saw everything. And Clara felt his eyes on her more than anyone else's. It was when she was clearing the plates from the adjacent table that her phone buzzed again, a frantic, insistent rhythm against her leg. She fumbled for it, her hands slick with nervous sweat. A picture message from Leo. It was the spray of white lilies on top of the casket. Below it, the text simply read, "They're about to start the eulogy. It's beautiful. Mum would have loved it." A sound escaped her throat, a choked, wounded gasp. The stack of plates in her hand tilted precariously. A heavy silver fork slid off the top and clattered onto the concrete floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. Every head turned. Mr. Sterling, standing by the host stand, shot her a look of pure venom. And from the table directly in front of her, a voice dripped with saccharin poison. "Well, well, it seems the service here is as clumsy as it is slow." It was Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Of course it was. Mrs. Vance was a gilded spoon institution, a woman whose weekly luncheons were the stuff of staff nightmares. She was thin and brittle, dressed in a Chanel suit the color of a pale bruise, her face a mask of expensive cosmetic procedures that had frozen her expression into one of permanent disdain. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Vance," Clara mumbled, bending to retrieve the fork, her face burning with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. "Sorry doesn't polish the silver, dear," Mrs. Vance said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. She turned to her two companions, both carbon copies of herself. One simply cannot find good help anymore. No focus, no dedication. Their minds are clearly elsewhere. Clara straightened up, the fork clutched in her hand like a weapon. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell this woman about the lilies, about the eulogy she was missing, about the promise that was tearing her apart. But she couldn't. She was a component in a machine, and the machine had to keep running. "My apologies," she said, her voice tight and strained. "It won't happen again." As she turned to retreat to the kitchen, she caught the eye of the man at table 12. He wasn't looking at Mrs. Vance. He was looking directly at Clara. There was no pity in his expression, none of the soft sympathy she'd come to dread. Instead, there was something else. A flicker of recognition, a sharp, analytical curiosity, as if he'd just solved a complex puzzle. He watched her walk away, and for the first time that day, Clara felt something other than grief. She felt seen. And it was terrifying. The kitchen was a chaotic sanctuary of steam and shouted orders. Clara deposited the dirty dishes, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unstack them. Marco, the head chef, a burly man with a heart much softer than his bellowing voice, glanced at her. "Hey, chica, you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine," she lied, grabbing a fresh tray. "It's Vance, isn't it? Don't let that old dragon get to you. She feeds on the misery of the working class." He winked, then his expression softened. "Seriously, kid, you sure you're all right?" Clara just nodded, unable to trust her voice. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't tell anyone. Admitting the truth out loud would make it too real. It would mean she had failed her mother in the most fundamental way. Back in the dining room, the atmosphere had grown colder. Mrs. Vance was holding court, her voice a piercing instrument of complaint. The steak was overcooked. The wine was improperly chilled. The lighting was giving her a headache. Each complaint was a thinly veiled attack on Clara, who had to return to the table again and again, offering apologies that tasted like ash in her mouth. With each trip, she was acutely aware of the man at table 12. He had not ordered any food. He just sat there, watching, his scotch untouched. He was like a hawk observing a field, waiting for the precise moment to strike. What was he waiting for? Her phone buzzed again. She ignored it. It buzzed again, a long, sustained vibration. A call. It was Leo. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he wouldn't be calling unless it was important. Her thumb hovered over the decline button, but her will broke. Ducking behind a large pillar near the service station, she answered, her voice a frantic whisper. "Leo, I can't talk." "They asked me to say a few words," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. She could hear the muffled sounds of the service in the background, a cough, the soft strains of an organ. "I'm up at the lectern right now, Clara. I'm looking out at everyone, and I keep seeing the empty space where you should be." "Leo, please," she begged, tears welling in her eyes, blurring the elegant dining room into a meaningless swirl of shapes and colors. "I don't know what to say about her without you," he confessed, his voice cracking. "You were the one who held her hand. You were the one who stayed up all night, sketching her face so you wouldn't forget it. You remember the stories. I need you." The line went quiet, but he didn't hang up. He was waiting. He was giving her one last chance to choose. And in that moment, the weight of her promise to her mother and the weight of her brother's need went to war inside her. "I can't," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. "Leo, I'm so sorry. I just can't." She ended the call, leaning her forehead against the cool marble of the pillar, a single hot tear tracing a path down her cheek. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to piece herself back together, trying to rebuild the wall of professional detachment that had crumbled around her. She had to get through this. Another 2 hours. Then she could go home to her empty apartment and fall apart in private. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and stepped out from behind the pillar, forcing a blank, neutral expression onto her face. And she walked straight into Mr. Sterling. "Miss Hayes," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Was that a personal call you were taking on the floor?" "Mr. Sterling, I do not pay you to conduct your social life in my establishment," he cut her off, his eyes like chips of ice. "This is your final warning. One more mistake, one dropped fork, one late order, one more tear, and you will be cleaning out your locker. Am I understood?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice barely audible. "Good. Now, Mrs. Vance is requesting her bill, and she looks particularly displeased. I suggest you handle it with the utmost care." He gave her a final, withering glare and swept away. Clara felt a cold dread settle over her. The final confrontation. She printed the bill, her hands moving with mechanical precision, her mind a numb, static-filled void. She placed the leather-bound check presenter on a small silver tray. As she picked it up, she noticed a small folded napkin tucked beside it. She unfolded it. On it, in exquisite, detailed pencil work, was a sketch of a tiny, defiant-looking sparrow, its head cocked, its wings braced as if against a storm. She'd drawn it earlier, a subconscious act of channeling her anxiety into the one thing she could control. She must have dropped it. She tucked the napkin into her apron pocket, took a fortifying breath, and walked toward Mrs. Vance's table, feeling like a soldier marching toward her own execution. The walk to Mrs. Vance's table felt like the longest in her life. Each step on the polished concrete was a deliberate act of will. She could feel the eyes of the other diners, the pitying glance from a woman at a nearby table, the cold, evaluative stare of Mr. Sterling from the host stand. And of course, the unwavering, intense gaze from the man at table 12. She placed the bill on the table with a hand that was surprisingly steady. "Whenever you are ready, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice a monotone. Mrs. Vance didn't even look at the bill. She fixed her cold, blue eyes on Clara. "I trust you've comped the steak," she said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Sterling did not authorize. "Then you are not only clumsy, but incompetent," Mrs. Vance snapped. She picked up her water glass and took a delicate sip, then placed it back down, deliberately positioning it perilously close to the edge of the table. "I have been a patron of this establishment since it opened. My husband is a significant investor in the restaurant group that owns this place. I expect a certain standard of service, a standard you have spectacularly failed to meet." Her friends murmured in agreement, a Greek chorus of the entitled. Clara stood frozen, the rehearsed apologies dying on her lips. All she could think about was Leo at the lectern, the empty space beside him, the lilies on the casket. A wave of reckless despair washed over her. What did any of this matter? What was the worst that could happen? She'd lose her job? Her life was already in ruins. "My mother died 2 days ago," Clara heard herself say. The words were quiet, spoken into the hushed atmosphere of the restaurant, yet they seemed to land with the force of a physical blow. Mrs. Vance's perfectly arched eyebrows rose. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. "The sob story. How very predictable. Everyone has problems, dear. It is the mark of a professional to leave them at the door. Your personal tragedies are not an excuse for poor performance. If anything, you should be grateful for the distraction of work." The cruelty of the statement was so profound, so breathtakingly callous, that it momentarily silenced Clara. Grateful? Grateful to be serving this hateful woman while her mother was being buried? The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface of her grief finally boiled over. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage, but a cold, clear, clarifying fury. "My mother," Clara said, her voice low but carrying a new, steely resonance, "taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account or the clothes they wear. She taught me it's measured by how they treat people who can do nothing for them. She taught me about dignity and grace." She looked directly into Mrs. Vance's eyes. Lessons you clearly never learned. A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. Mrs. Vance's face, already a pale mask, seemed to crumble. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. Mr. Sterling was already striding toward them, his face a thundercloud of fury. "That's it, Hayes. You're fired. Get your things and get out," he roared, his voice breaking the sacred hush of the dining room. Mrs. Vance, recovering her composure, gave a triumphant smirk. "And about time," she sniffed. "Perhaps now you can hire someone with a bit of breeding." Clara didn't flinch. She felt strangely calm, liberated. She had lost everything, so there was nothing left to fear. She simply nodded, turned to walk away, and in that moment of finality, a new voice cut through the tension. "I don't think she'll be going anywhere." The voice was deep, calm, and carried an effortless authority that made everyone, including Mr. Sterling, stop dead. It came from table 12. The man in the grey suit had risen to his feet. He was taller than he had appeared sitting down, with a presence that seemed to shrink the room around him. He walked slowly toward their table, his hands in his pockets. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were fixed on Mrs. Vance. "Eleanor," he said, his tone casual, as if greeting an old, slightly disappointing acquaintance. "Still finding fault with the world, I see. Some things never change." Mrs. Vance's jaw dropped. "Julian? Julian Croft? What on earth are you doing here?" Her voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by a flustered, sycophantic tone. The man, Julian Croft, gave a small, humourless smile. "I was attempting to have a quiet drink, an endeavour you have made quite impossible." He turned his gaze to Mr. Sterling, who looked as if he was about to faint. "And you must be the manager." "Mr. Croft, sir. It is an honour," Sterling stammered, wiping a hand on his trousers. "I had no idea you were—" "I'm aware," Croft cut him off smoothly. "I prefer it that way. It allows one to get a much more accurate assessment of an establishment. And my assessment," he paused, his eyes sweeping from Sterling's terrified face to Mrs. Vance's nervous one, "is that the problem here is not with your staff." He turned his attention back to Mrs. Vance. "Eleanor, your husband's company, Vance Capital, is currently seeking a rather significant infusion of cash from my primary investment firm, are they not? I believe the final meeting is next Tuesday." The colour drained completely from Mrs. Vance's face. She looked horrified. "Julian, this has nothing to do with business." "Everything has to do with business," Croft replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it seemed to carry more weight than Sterling's shouts. "Business is about people. It's about character. And I have to say, what I have witnessed here today does not inspire my confidence in the judgment of anyone associated with the Vance name." He let the threat hang in the air, a gleaming guillotine of financial ruin. Mrs. Vance and her friends were utterly silent, their faces a mixture of fear and humiliation. Croft then turned his full attention to Clara. For the first time, his expression softened, just slightly. The analytical curiosity was replaced by something that looked almost like empathy. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice now gentle, "I apologize for this theatrical display. It was not my intention, but I find I have a profound intolerance for bullies." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a sleek, silver pen. "Mr. Sterling," he said, not looking at the manager, "I am buying out your restaurant for the remainder of the day. Every table, every seat. I will write you a check that will cover your projected revenue, plus a 20% bonus for the inconvenience. In return, your entire staff, from the chefs to the busboys, will receive their full day's wages, plus a bonus equivalent to 1 week's pay. From me, personally." Sterling stared, dumbfounded. "Sir, I don't understand." "It's quite simple," Croft said, scribbling figures onto the check. "I am paying for you all to go home. There is, however, one non-negotiable condition." He tore the check from the book with a sharp, satisfying rip and held it out. His eyes met Clara's. "Miss Hayes is to be given a 1-month, fully paid leave of absence, effective immediately. And she is to leave this restaurant right now in a car that I will have waiting for her, to go and say goodbye to her mother." He then pulled out a second, personal check and a folded piece of paper. He walked over to Clara, his movements deliberate and calm amidst the stunned silence of the dining room. "This," he said, handing her the check, "should take care of any lingering medical expenses. Consider it an investment in grace under pressure." He then handed her the folded paper. "And this is the number of my personal assistant. She will arrange for the car and handle the logistics with the hospital's billing department. You need not think about it again." Clara stared at the check in her hand. The number written on it was astronomical. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was freedom. It was an impossible, unbelievable miracle. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time that day, they were not tears of grief or shame. They were tears of overwhelming, incomprehensible relief. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice choked. "Why would you do this?" Mr. Croft looked at her, and for a moment the powerful billionaire vanished, and she saw an older man with a deep, ancient sadness in his eyes. "Because," he said softly, "I once missed the chance to say goodbye to my own father, because I thought a business deal was more important. It remains the single greatest regret of my life. No one should have to make that choice." He then glanced down at her apron pocket, where the corner of the napkin with the sparrow sketch was sticking out. "Besides," he added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, "I have a fondness for sparrows. They're resilient birds. Now go. Your mother is waiting." The world outside the Gilded Spoon felt surreal, like stepping from a dark, suffocating theatre into the bright, unfiltered light of day. The city sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the L train overhead, the cacophony of traffic, were sharp and immediate. A sleek, black town car was idling at the curb, just as Mr. Croft had promised. The driver, a kind-faced man in a crisp suit, opened the door for her without a word, as if he'd been expecting her all along. As the car pulled smoothly into traffic, Clara leaned her head against the cool leather of the seat and finally allowed herself to break. The sobs came in great, shuddering waves, a storm of grief, relief, and shock that left her breathless. She clutched the 2 checks in her hand, the paper crinkling in her tight grip. They didn't feel real. None of it felt real. The last hour had rewritten the entire landscape of her life. She gave the driver the address for the cemetery, her voice thick and unsteady. The journey across town was a blur. She saw faces on the sidewalk, snippets of lives being lived, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. Just an hour ago, she had been one of them, trapped in the relentless grind of survival. Now, she was something else. Someone who had been plucked from her life by an act of impossible kindness. When they arrived at Oakwood Cemetery, the driver simply said, "Take all the time you need, miss. I will be right here." She walked through the ornate iron gates, her legs feeling unsteady. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cut grass. In the distance, she saw a small cluster of people gathered under a large oak tree, their dark clothes stark against the green of the lawn. It was them. It was her family. Leo saw her first. He was standing slightly apart from the group, his shoulders slumped. His head snapped up as she approached, and his face was a canvas of disbelief, then confusion, then a dawning, overwhelming relief. He ran to meet her, closing the distance in a few long strides. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask where she'd been or how she'd gotten away. He just wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to piece her back together. "You came," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "Clara, you came." "I'm here," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry." "It doesn't matter now," he said, pulling back to look at her, his hands on her shoulders. The world outside the heavy glass doors of the Gilded Spoon was an assault, not of noise or chaos, but of sheer, unfiltered reality. The air, thick with the scent of rain-dampened pavement and street food, filled her lungs with a gasp, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled atmosphere she had just fled. Each sound, the percussive clatter of the L train on the tracks overhead, the distant, mournful cry of a siren, the layered conversations of pedestrians, was an individual note in a symphony she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Inside, there had only been the muted clink of silver on porcelain and the venomous whispers of Mrs. Vance. Out here, there was life, messy and loud and indifferent. A black Lincoln Navigator, sleek and silent as a panther, was parked at the curb. The driver, a man with a gentle face and weary eyes, stepped out and opened the rear door for her, his movements fluid and practiced. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a low, respectful murmur. It was the first time all day someone had said her name without a preceding hiss of anger or a tone of pity. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sealing her inside a capsule of quiet leather and polished wood. The city's symphony was instantly muted to a distant hum. She leaned her head back against the cool headrest, and the dam finally broke. It was not a gentle weeping. It was a complete and total unraveling, a series of ragged, soul-deep sobs that tore from her chest, each one carrying a fragment of the day's horror. The weight of the tray, Sterling's icy glare, the clatter of the fallen fork, Leo's broken voice on the phone, the spray of white lilies in the photo, her mother's last whispered promise. She wept for the shame and the fury, for the grief she had been forced to suppress until it had nearly choked her. And beneath it all, she wept with a terrifying, disorienting wave of relief, so profound it felt like another form of grief. In her clenched fist, 2 pieces of paper were crumpled into a damp ball. One was a check from a bank she had only ever seen in movies, made out to a hospital for a sum that could have purchased a small house. The other was a personal check with her name on it, the amount so ludicrous, so life-altering, that it seemed like a typo. It was the price of her humiliation, the reward for her dignity, a ransom paid for a life she thought she had lost. It didn't feel real. Julian Croft didn't feel real. He was a ghost, a spectre of impossible wealth who had drifted into her life, rearranged all the furniture, and vanished, leaving only this strange, paper proof of his existence. "The cemetery, miss?" the driver asked gently, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. His expression was one of practiced neutrality, yet she saw a flicker of profound empathy there. He had likely driven Mr. Croft away from other such scenes. She managed a choked, "Yes, please." Oak Woods. The drive was a journey through a dreamscape. The familiar Chicago streets looked alien through the tinted glass. She saw a young woman, no older than herself, laughing with a friend as they dodged a puddle. She saw a man in a worn jacket, waiting for a bus, his face etched with a fatigue she knew intimately. These were her people. An hour ago, she had been one of them, her existence defined by the relentless calculus of rent and bills, of shifts and survival. Now, she was floating above it all in a leather-scented bubble, clutching a fortune she hadn't earned, on her way to a funeral she had almost missed. The dislocation was dizzying. She felt like an astronaut whose tether had been cut, drifting in the silent space between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. When they reached the cemetery's grand wrought-iron gates, the driver pulled to a stop on the quiet side road. "Take all the time you need," he said, his voice soft. "I'll be right here when you're ready." Her legs were unsteady as she walked onto the manicured grounds. The air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and damp soil, a smell of endings and beginnings. She saw them in the distance, a small, somber flock of black-clad figures gathered beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. Her family. And as she drew closer, she saw the raw, open wound in the earth beside them. Leo saw her first. He was standing slightly apart, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders bowed under a weight that was more than just grief. His head lifted, and for a long moment he just stared, his face a mask of disbelief. Then the mask crumbled, replaced by a flood of emotion, confusion, questioning, and finally a dawning, radiant relief that seemed to physically lift him. He didn't walk. He ran, covering the green expanse between them in a few desperate, loping strides. He didn't ask why she was late, or how she had escaped the prison of her job. He didn't ask a single question. He just threw his arms around her, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it felt like he was trying to fuse their broken pieces back together. She buried her face in the rough wool of his coat, inhaling the familiar scent of him, and clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "You came," he whispered, his voice cracking against her hair. The two words held a universe of fear and forgiveness. "Clara, you came. I'm here," she sobbed, the words muffled against his shoulder. "Leo, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "Shh, it doesn't matter," he said, his own tears finally falling. "Nothing matters now. You're here." He kept one arm firmly around her as he led her to the graveside. The small service was over, but no one had left. They had been waiting. For her. Her Aunt Carol, whose pity she had dreaded, looked at her with eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. Her cousins offered small, sad smiles. No one looked at her with judgment. They simply parted, opening a path for her, clearing the empty space Leo had told her about, the space that had been hers all along. And then she saw it. The casket, polished mahogany, gleaming in the soft afternoon light. The spray of white lilies atop it was breathtaking, each petal a perfect, silent prayer. She sank to her knees on the soft grass, the dampness seeping through her thin black trousers. Her trembling fingers reached out, touching the cool, smooth wood. This was the final barrier, the last few inches of reality separating her from the woman who had given her life. She laid her palm flat against the lid, as if she could feel her mother's warmth through the wood and the earth, and she began to speak, her words a whispered torrent into the hallowed silence. "I'm here, Mum. I'm sorry I'm late. I tried. I really, really tried. You told me not to let it break me. And I thought that meant the job. I thought it meant paying the bills. I thought I was keeping the promise by being strong, by not falling apart. But I was wrong. It was breaking me. Every minute I was in that place, serving people who didn't care while you were here, it was grinding me into dust. I almost broke, Mum. I almost chose the wrong thing. But I'm here now." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "Something happened. Something impossible. A man, he saw me. Not just the uniform, Mum. He saw me. He saw that I was breaking. And he fixed it. He paid for everything. All of it. He told me to come and say goodbye to you. He had sad eyes, like he was saying goodbye to someone, too." She let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "He liked my drawing of the sparrow. Remember how we used to watch them from the kitchen window? You said they were small but tough. You said they were survivors." She pressed her forehead to the casket, the world narrowing to this single point of contact. "I kept the promise, Mum, the real one. I didn't give up my life for your death. I'm going to live. I swear I am. I'm here to say goodbye. I love you. I love you so much." The days that followed were a disorienting haze, a strange, weightless existence in the vacuum left by grief and crushing responsibility. The first morning, She woke with a jolt of panic at 5 NQM, her body conditioned for the early shift, her muscles already tensing for the weight of the industrial tray. But there was no alarm, only the gentle grey light filtering through her window and the profound silence of an apartment that was no longer a temporary refuge between shifts, but a home. She slept for 14 hours that day, and when she woke, it was the first time in 2 years that the first thought in her head wasn't about money. The absence of that constant, gnawing anxiety was a physical sensation, a lightness in her chest so unfamiliar, it was almost alarming. Mr. Croft's assistant, Evelyn, was a voice on the phone, a marvel of brisk, dispassionate efficiency. She spoke of wire transfers and hospital billing departments with the same detached calm one might use to order office supplies. With a series of emails and phone calls that Clara was merely copied on, 2 years of suffocating medical debt, a monstrous entity that had haunted every waking moment and stalked her dreams, was vanquished. An official letter arrived from the hospital, its final balance reading 0.0 Clara stared at it for a full hour, tracing the zeros with her finger. It was an incantation, a magic spell that had rendered the monster into smoke. She and Leo began the sacred, heartbreaking task of dismantling their mother's life. They sorted through closets that still held the faint, familiar scent of lavender and rising bread. They packed away mismatched teacups and worn gardening gloves. But it was not a task of packing away. It was one of excavation. Each object unearthed a memory, a story. In a dusty box in the back of a wardrobe, they found it, her mother's old portfolio from a community college art class she'd taken decades ago. It was filled with charcoal studies of birds, delicate watercolors of flowers from her garden, and tucked in the very back, a surprisingly deft and tender portrait of a 5-year-old Clara, her face smudged with dirt, a defiant sparrow perched on her outstretched finger. She had forgotten ever posing for it. She had forgotten the talent her mother had possessed, a talent she had quietly set aside to raise a family, to pick up extra shifts, to pay for braces and school trips. Clara ran her fingers over the charcoal lines, a profound and aching understanding dawning on her. She hadn't just inherited her mother's auburn hair, she had inherited her deferred dream. A week after the funeral, a courier delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope. It bore the sleek, minimalist logo of Croft Enterprises. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a glossy brochure for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, its pages filled with images of sun-drenched studios and brilliant, challenging art. Tucked inside was a completed application form with all of her personal details already filled in. Clipped to the top was a small, embossed card. The elegant, decisive script read, "A starting point. Evelyn will manage the portfolio submission and tuition." Clara dropped onto her sofa as if her legs had given out. It was her dream. The secret, sacred ambition she had buried so deep, she had convinced herself it was dead. For years her art had been confined to the margins, napkin sketches, doodles on order pads, ghosts of a life she was too pragmatic to believe in. And now, a stranger was not just opening the door to that life, he was trying to shove her through it. A cold wave of something akin to panic washed over her. This was too much. The debt was one thing. That was a rescue. This felt like a purchase. It felt like an obligation she could never repay. She was his project, his penance, the living embodiment of his regret. She imagined him checking on her progress like a stock portfolio, her life another one of his investments. The thought was suffocating. Who was she to bear the weight of a billionaire's atonement? She found the number Evelyn had given her, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Evelyn!" The brisk voice answered. "It's Clara Hayes," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. I received the application. Excellent. Your portfolio is due next Friday. I suggest you begin curating your pieces. That's why I'm calling," Clara stammered, forcing herself to take a breath. "I can't accept this. It's an extraordinary gesture, but I can't. I haven't earned it. I need to speak to Mr. Croft, to thank him properly, and to tell him myself." A beat of silence stretched over the line. When Evelyn spoke again, the professional frost in her voice had thawed slightly. "Mr. Croft does not take unscheduled meetings, Miss Hayes. His time is finite." However, another pause. "I have a feeling he will want to hear this from you directly. He is in the Chicago office tomorrow, 4 o'clock. The Croft Enterprises Tower was not a building, it was a statement, a shard of smoked glass and obsidian steel that pierced the sky, arrogantly reflecting the lesser buildings around it. Riding the silent, whisper-fast elevator to the penthouse, Clara felt a crushing sense of inadequacy. She wore her only good black dress, the one she'd worn to the funeral, and felt like a child playing dress-up. The office was a cathedral of minimalist wealth. It was vast, silent, and almost entirely empty, save for a desk that looked like a slab of polished meteorite and a few severe-looking chairs. The entire western wall was a single, seamless pane of glass, offering a god's-eye view of Chicago sprawling toward the horizon, the lake a sheet of hammered silver in the afternoon sun. Julian Croft was not at the desk. He stood before the window, a dark silhouette against the blinding sky. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice calm and resonant, not turning around. "Evelyn said you wished to see me." "Mr. Croft." Her voice trembled, and she hated herself for it. She clasped her hands together to still them. "I came to thank you. For everything. You have no idea what you've done for my family. You gave me a gift I can never repay." "Good," he said simply. "Repayable gifts are merely transactions." "But the school," she pressed on, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I can't accept it. It's a fantasy. It's a life for someone else, someone who's earned it. I haven't done anything to deserve a gift like that." He turned then, slowly. The powerful titan of industry she expected was gone. In his place was an older man, his face etched with a profound, soul-deep weariness that his expensive suit could not conceal. "Deserve," he mused, walking slowly toward her. "It's a meaningless word. Did I deserve to be born to a father who worked his fingers to the bone so I could go to college? Did Eleanor Vance deserve the privilege she was abusing when I met you? The universe does not distribute fortunes, Miss Hayes, either good or bad, based on merit. It is stubbornly, infuriatingly random. A gift is not a reward for past actions. It is a tool for future ones. The only relevant question is not whether you deserve it, but what you will do with it." He led her to a small, stark, white wall between two towering bookshelves. There, mounted under museum-quality, non-reflective glass and illuminated by a single focused light, was a small, folded napkin. On it was her drawing, the tiny defiant sparrow, its wings braced against a storm she had only been imagining then. It was framed with the reverence of a lost masterpiece. "My father," Croft said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with a decades-old grief, "was a carpenter. He smelled of sawdust and sweat and quiet disappointment. But his soul was that of an artist. He loved birds. He knew all their songs, all their habits. He would sit for hours, sketching them in a cheap notebook. His drawings, they were alive. He was offered a scholarship once. to a small art school, but I was a baby, and my mother was ill. So he put down his pencils and picked up his hammer for good. He built houses for other families, while ours barely scraped by. He worked himself into an early grave so that I could have the chances he never had. He stared at the drawing, but Clara knew he was seeing something else entirely. The week he was dying, I was in Tokyo. I was closing the deal that made me a billionaire. I told myself I was honoring him, validating his sacrifice by becoming this huge success. I was on a conference call when he tried to reach me one last time. I let it go to voicemail. He was gone by the time I landed in New York. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. I have spent 40 years building an empire on a foundation of that single, monumental failure. I have everything, and it is all worthless. When I saw you in that restaurant, holding yourself together with sheer force of will, being degraded by a woman who wouldn't last 10 seconds in your life, I saw a strength my father had. And then, when I saw that drawing, he gestured to the framed napkin. I saw his ghost. I saw the life he should have had. His gaze was intense, pleading. This isn't charity, Clara. It's the most selfish act I've committed in my adult life. You are a second chance. A ridiculously improbable, cosmically granted second chance for me to honor my father in the only way I have left, by giving his dream to someone who has his talent and his resilience, to you. So please, his voice cracked, the sound of a powerful man breaking. Do not throw my penance back in my face. Take this gift. Go to that school. Fill it with your work. Build a life that would make your mother proud. Do it for you. Do it for her. And do it for a carpenter who deserved to be an artist. Standing in that silent, sun-drenched office, suspended between the sky and the city, Clara finally understood. This was not a fairy tale. There was no prince, no princess. This was a ghost story, a story of 2 grieving children, one a young woman, one an old man, haunted by the parents they had lost and the promises they had made. This was a story of regret and the strange, tangled ways a life can be redeemed by touching another. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her face. Okay, she whispered, the word a surrender and a vow. Okay, Julian, I will. 2 years later, the gallery hummed. It was the low, appreciative buzz of a successful opening night, a mixture of clinking wine glasses, murmured praise, and the quiet contemplation of art. The space was small, an independent gallery in the West Loop, but the walls were alive. They were covered in Clara's work, large-scale charcoal and ink drawings that captured the soul of the city, not its iconic skyline, but its hidden moments of grace and struggle. The exhausted face of a nurse on the night bus, her reflection a ghostly double in the dark window, the gnarled, elegant hands of a bookseller, the explosive joy of children running through the spray of an open fire hydrant on a sweltering summer day. The critics had praised her work for its brutal empathy and unflinching compassion. She didn't just draw what she saw, she drew what she felt. The centerpiece of the show, given the entire back wall, was a portrait of her mother. It was not the sick, frail woman from the end, but the vibrant woman from Clara's memory, captured mid-laugh in her sun-drenched garden, her hands caked with rich soil, her face tilted up to a light source outside the frame. The title on the small placard read simply, Grace. Clara moved through the room, no longer the hollow-eyed, haunted girl from the Gilded Spoon, but a poised, confident woman whose gaze was direct and warm. Leo was there, his arm around his wife, his face glowing with a pride so fierce it was practically a physical presence. A small group from the restaurant had come too. Marco, the head chef, enveloped her in a bear hug that smelled of garlic and success. Under new management, instituted shortly after Mr. Croft's visit, the Gilded Spoon had become a place where the staff were treated like human beings. Across the room, standing partially obscured by a tall sculpture, was Julian Croft. He was alone, nursing a glass of water, making no attempt to mingle. He was simply watching the room, a quiet, almost peaceful smile on his face. He caught her eye, and the smile deepened. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a nod of approval or ownership. It was a nod of thanks. She made her way over to him. "You came," she said softly. "I would not have missed it," he replied, his eyes scanning the walls. He would have loved this, all of it. "Thank you, Julian," she said, the words finally feeling adequate. "For the starting point." "Thank you, Clara," he said, his gaze returning to her, clear and steady. "For running with it." A young woman approached them, her eyes shining as she looked at Clara. "Excuse me," she said. "Your work, the portrait of your mother is just... it's filled with so much love." Clara looked across the gallery at the laughing face of her mother, then at the quiet, sad-eyed billionaire beside her, and finally, through the large window, at the glittering, indifferent, beautiful city that she had finally made her own. She thought of the promise, the one that had almost crushed her. She had been so wrong about what it meant. It wasn't a command to endure, it was permission to live, to not just survive, but to thrive, to build a life of purpose and passion, to find grace, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet dignity of a well-drawn line, in the kindness of a stranger, in the defiant resilience of a sparrow bracing against the storm. "Yes," she said to the young woman, her voice clear and strong and full of a joy she had earned. "It is